Chapter 80 Stern Lawgiver, yet you do wear the Godhead's most benignant grace, nor know we anything so fair as is the smile upon your face. Flowers laugh before you on their beds, and fragrance in your footing treads. You do preserve the stars from wrong, and the most ancient heavens, through you, are fresh and strong. Wordsworth, Ode to Duty. When Dorothea had seen Mr. Fairbrother in the morning, she had promised to go and dine at the parsonage on her return from Freshitt. There was a frequent interchange of visits between her and the Fairbrother family, which enabled her to say that she was not at all lonely at the manor, and to resist for the present the severe prescription of a lady companion. When she reached home and remembered her engagement, she was glad of it, and finding that she had still an hour before she could dress for dinner, she walked straight to the schoolhouse and entered into a conversation with the master and mistress about the new bell, giving eager attention to their small details and repetitions, and getting up a dramatic sense that her life was very busy. She paused on her way back to talk to old Master Bunny, who was putting in some garden seeds, and discoursed wisely with that rural sage about the crops that would make the most return on a perch of ground, and the result of 60 years' experience as to soils, namely, that if your soil was pretty mellow it would do, but if there came wet to make it all of a mummy, why then, finding that the social spirit had beguiled her into being rather late, she dressed hastily and went over to the parsonage rather earlier than was necessary. That house was never dull. Mr. Fairbrother, like another White of Selborne, having continually something new to tell of his inarticulate guests and protégés, whom he was teaching the boys not to torment, and he had just set up a pair of beautiful goats to be pets of the village in general, and to walk at large as sacred animals. The evening went by cheerfully till after tea, Dorothea talking more than usual, and dilating with Mr. Fairbrother on the possible histories of creatures that converse compendiously with their antennae, and for aught we know may hold reformed parliaments, when suddenly some inarticulate little sounds were heard which called everybody's attention. "Henrietta Noble," said Mrs. Fairbrother, seeing her small sister moving about the furniture legs distressfully. "What is the matter?" "I have lost my tortoiseshell lozenge box. I fear the kitten has rolled it away," said the tiny old lady, involuntarily continuing her beaver-like notes. "Is it a great treasure, aunt?" said Mr. Fairbrother, putting up his glasses and looking at the carpet. "Mr. Ladislaw gave it me," said Miss Noble. "A German box, very pretty, but if it falls it always spins away as far as it can." "Oh, if it is Ladislaw's present," said Mr. Fairbrother, in a deep tone of comprehension, getting up and hunting. The box was found at last under a chiffonier, and Miss Noble grasped it with delight, saying, "It was under a fender the last time." "That is an affair of the heart with my aunt," said Mr. Fairbrother, smiling at Dorothea, as he reseated himself. "If Henrietta Noble forms an attachment to any one, Mrs. Casaubon," said his mother, emphatically, "she is like a dog. She would take their shoes for a pillow and sleep the better." "Mr. Ladislaw's shoes, I would," said Henrietta Noble. Dorothea made an attempt at smiling in return. She was surprised and annoyed to find that her heart was palpitating violently, and that it was quite useless to try after a recovery of her former animation. Alarmed at herself, fearing some further betrayal of a change so marked in its occasion, she rose and said in a low voice with undisguised anxiety, "I must go. I have overtired myself." Mr. Fairbrother, quick in perception, rose and said, "It is true, you must have half exhausted yourself in talking about Lydgate. That sort of work tells upon one after the excitement is over." He gave her his arm back to the manor, but Dorothea did not attempt to speak. Evening, when he said good night, the limit of resistance was reached, and she had sunk back helpless within the clutch of inescapable anguish. Dismissing Tantrip with a few faint words, she locked her door, and turning away from it towards the vacant room, she pressed her hands hard on the top of her head, and moaned out, "Oh, I did love him." Then came the hour in which the waves of suffering shook her too thoroughly to leave any power of thought. She could only cry in loud whispers, between her sobs, after her lost belief which she had planted and kept alive from a very little seed since the days in Rome, after her lost joy of clinging with silent love and faith to one who, misprized by others, was worthy in her thought, after her lost woman's pride of reigning in his memory, after her sweet dim perspective of hope, that along some pathway they should meet with unchanged recognition and take up the backward years as a yesterday. In that hour she repeated what the merciful eyes of solitude have looked on for ages in the spiritual struggles of man. She besought hardness, and coldness, and aching weariness to bring her relief from the mysterious incorporeal May of her anguish. She lay on the bare floor and let the night grow cold around her, while her grand woman's frame was shaken by sobs as if she had been a despairing child. There were two images, two living forms that tore her heart in two, as if it had been the heart of a mother who seems to see her child divided by the sword, and presses one bleeding half to her breast while her gaze goes forth in agony towards the half which is carried away by the lying woman that has never known the mother's pang. Here, with the nearness of an answering smile, here within the vibrating bond of mutual speech, was the bright creature whom she had trusted, who had come to her like the spirit of morning visiting the dim vault where she sat as the bride of a worn-out life. And now, with a full consciousness which had never awakened before, she stretched out her arms towards him and cried with bitter cries that their nearness was a parting vision. She discovered her passion to herself in the unshrinking utterance of despair, and there, aloof, yet persistently with her, moving wherever she moved, was the will Ladislaw who was a changed belief exhausted of hope, a detected illusion, no, a living man towards whom there could not yet struggle any wail of regretful pity from the amid of scorn and indignation and jealous offended pride. The fire of Dorothea's anger was not easily spent, and it flamed out in fitful returns of spurning reproach. Why had he come obtruding his life into hers, that may have been whole enough without him? Why had he brought his cheap regard and his lip-born words to her, who had nothing paltry to give in exchange? He knew that he was deluding her, wished, in the very moment of farewell, to make her believe that he gave her the whole price of her heart, and knew that he had spent it half before. Why had he not stayed among the crowd of whom she asked nothing, but only prayed that they may be less contemptible? But she lost energy at last evening for her loud whispered cries and moans. She subsided into helpless sobs, and on the cold floor she sobbed herself to sleep. In the chill hours of the morning twilight, when all was dim around her, she awoke, not with any amazed wondering where she was or what had happened, but with the clearest consciousness that she was looking into the eyes of sorrow. She rose and wrapped warm things around her, and seated herself in a great chair where she had often watched before. She was vigorous enough to have borne that hard night without feeling ill in body, beyond some aching and fatigue. But she had waked to a new condition. She felt as if her soul had been liberated from its terrible conflict. She was no longer wrestling with her grief, but could sit down with it as a lasting companion and make it a sharer in her thoughts. For now the thoughts came thickly. It was not in Dorothea's nature, for longer than the duration of a paroxysm, to sit in the narrow cell of her calamity, in the besotted misery of a consciousness that only sees another's lot as an accident of its own. She began now to live through that yesterday morning deliberately again, forcing herself to dwell on every detail and its possible meaning. Was she alone in that scene? Was it her event only? She forced herself to think of it as bound up with another woman's life, a woman towards whom she had set out with a longing to carry some clearness and comfort into her beclouded youth. In her first upleap of jealous indignation and disgust, when quitting the hateful room, she had flung away all the mercy with which she had undertaken that visit. She had enveloped both Will and Rosamond in her burning scorn, and it seemed to her as if Rosamond were burned out of her sight forever. But that base prompting which makes a woman more cruel to a rival than to a faithless lover could have no strength of recurrence in Dorothea when the dominant spirit of justice within her had once overcome the tumult, and had once shown her the truer measure of things. All the active thought with which she had before been representing to herself the trials of Lydgate's lot, and this young marriage union which, like her own, seemed to have its hidden as well as evident troubles, all this vivid sympathetic experience returned to her now as a power, It asserted itself as acquired knowledge asserts itself and will not let us see as we saw in the day of our ignorance. She said to her own irremediable grief that it should make her more helpful, instead of driving her back from effort. And what sort of crisis may not this be in three lives whose contact with hers laid an obligation on her as if they had been suppliants bearing the sacred branch? The objects of her rescue were not to be sought out by her fancy, they were chosen for her. She yearned towards the perfect right, that it may make a throne within her, and rule her errant will. What should I do? How should I act now, this very day, if I could clutch my own pain, and compel it to silence, and think of those three? It had taken long for her to come to that question, and there was light piercing into the room. She opened her curtains, and looked out towards the bit of road that lay in view, with fields beyond outside the entrance gates. On the road there was a man with a bundle on his back, and a woman carrying her baby. In the field she could see figures moving, perhaps the shepherd with his dog. Far off in the bending sky was the pearly light, and she felt the largeness of the world, and the manifold wakings of men to labor and endurance. She was a part of that involuntary, palpitating life, and could neither look out on it from her luxurious shelter as a mere spectator, nor hide her eyes in selfish complaining. What she would resolve to do that day did not yet seem quite clear, but something that she could achieve stirred her as with an approaching murmur which would soon gather distinctness. She took off the clothes, which seemed to have some of the weariness of a hard watching in them, and began to make her toilet. Soon she rang for Tantrip, who came in her dressing gown. "Why, madam, you've never been in bed this blessed night," burst out Tantrip, looking first at the bed and then at Dorothea's face, which in spite of bathing had the pale cheeks and pink eyelids of a Mater Dolorosa. "You'll kill yourself, you will. And a body may think now you had a right to give yourself a little comfort." "Don't be alarmed, Tantrip," said Dorothea, smiling. "I have slept. I am not ill. I shall be glad of a cup of coffee as soon as possible. And I want you to bring me my new dress, and most likely I shall want my new bonnet today. They've lain there a month and more ready for you, madam, and most thankful I shall be to see you with a couple o' pounds worth less of crape," said Tantrip, stooping to light the fire. "There's a reason in mourning, as I've always said, and 3 folds at the bottom of your skirt and a plain quilling in your bonnet, and if ever anybody looked like an angel, it's you in a net quilling, is what's consistent for a 2nd year. At least, that's my thinking," ended Tantrip, looking anxiously at the fire. "And if anybody was to marry me flattering himself I should wear those hideous weepers 2 years for him, he'd be deceived by his own vanity, that's all." "The fire will do, my good Tan," said Dorothea, speaking as she used to do in the old Lausanne days, only with a very low voice. "Get me the coffee." She folded herself in the large chair, and leaned her head against it in fatigued quiescence, while Tantrip went away wondering at this strange contrariness in her young mistress, that just the morning when she had more of a widow's face than ever, she should have asked for her lighter mourning which she had waived before. Tantrip would never have found the clue to this mystery. Dorothea wished to acknowledge that she had not the less an active life before her because she had buried a private joy, and the tradition that fresh garments belonged to all initiation, haunting her mind, made her grasp after evening that slight outward help towards calm resolve. For the resolve was not easy. Chapter LXXXI. Du Erdworst auch dies Nacht bestendig. Und Athemist nu erquicht zu meinen FSN, beginnest skan mit Lust mich zu umgeben, du regst und RHRS dir ein KRF diges beschlissen, zum HCH sten dasin immerfort zu streben, Faust, to R. Thale. When Dorothea was again at Lydgate's door speaking to Martha, he was in the room close by with the door ajar, preparing to go out. He heard her voice, and immediately came to her. "Do you think that Mrs. Lydgate can receive me this morning?" she said, having reflected that it would be better to leave out all allusion to her previous visit. "I have no doubt she will," said Lydgate, suppressing his thought about Dorothea's looks, which were as much changed as Rosamond's. "If you will be kind enough to come in and let me tell her that you are here. She has not been very well since you were here yesterday, but she is better this morning, and I think it is very likely that she will be cheered by seeing you again." It was plain that Lydgate, as Dorothea had expected, knew nothing about the circumstances of her yesterday's visit. No, he appeared to imagine that she had carried it out according to her intention. She had prepared a little note asking Rosamond to see her, which she would have given to the servant if he had not been in the way. But now she was in much anxiety as to the result of his announcement. After leading her into the drawing-room, he paused to take a letter from his pocket and put it into her hands, saying, "I wrote this last night, and was going to carry it to Lowick in my ride." When one is grateful for something too good for common thanks, writing is less unsatisfactory than speech. One does not at least hear how inadequate the words are. Dorothea's face brightened. "It is I who have most to thank for, since you have let me take that place." "You have consented?" she said, suddenly doubting. "Yes, the check is going to Bulstrode today." He said no more, but went upstairs to Rosamond, who had but lately finished dressing herself, and sat languidly wondering what she should do next. Her habitual industry in small things, evening in the days of her sadness, prompting her to begin some kind of occupation, which she dragged through slowly or paused in from lack of interest. She looked ill, but had recovered her usual quietude of manner, and Lydgate had feared to disturb her by any questions. He had told her of Dorothea's letter containing the check, and afterwards he had said, "Ladislaw is come, Rosie. He sat with me last night. I dare say he will be here again today. I thought he looked rather battered and depressed." And Rosamond had made no reply. Now, when he came up, he said to her very gently, "Rosie, dear, Mrs. Cassopin is come to see you again. You would like to see her, would you not?" That she colored and gave rather a startled movement did not surprise him after the agitation produced by the interview yesterday, a beneficent agitation, he thought, since it seemed to have made her turn to him again. Rosamond dared not say no. She dared not, with the tone of her voice, touch the facts of yesterday. Why had Mrs. Cassopin come again? The answer was a blank, which Rosamond could only fill up with dread, for Ladislaw's lacerating words had made every thought of Dorothea a fresh smart to her. Nevertheless, in her new humiliating uncertainty she dared do nothing but comply. She did not say yes, but she rose and let Lydgate put a light shawl over her shoulders, while he said, "I am going out immediately." Then something crossed her mind which prompted her to say, "Pray tell Martha not to bring any one else into the drawing-room." And Lydgate assented, thinking that he fully understood this wish. He led her down to the drawing-room door, and then turned away, observing to himself that he was rather a blundering husband to be dependent for his wife's trust in him on the influence of another woman. Rosamond, wrapping her soft shawl around her as she walked towards Dorothea, was inwardly wrapping her soul in cold reserve. Had Mrs. Cassopin come to say anything to her about Will? If so, it was a liberty that Rosamond resented, and she prepared herself to meet every word with polite impassibility. Will had bruised her pride too sorely for her to feel any compunction towards him, and Dorothea, her own injury seemed much the greater. Dorothea was not only the preferred woman, but had also a formidable advantage in being Lydgate's benefactor, and to poor Rosamond's pained, confused vision it seemed that this Mrs. Cassopin, this woman who predominated in all things concerning her, must have come now with a sense of having the advantage, and with animosity prompting her to use it truly, not Rosamond only, but any one else, knowing the outer facts of the case, and not the simple inspiration on which Dorothea acted, may well have wondered why she came, looking like the lovely ghost of herself, her graceful slimness wrapped in her soft white shawl, the rounded infantine mouth and cheek inevitably suggesting mildness and innocence. Rosamond paused at 3 yards' distance from her visitor and bowed. But Dorothea, who had taken off her gloves, from an impulse which she could never resist when she wanted a sense of freedom, came forward, and with her face full of a sad yet sweet openness, put out her hand. Rosamond could not avoid meeting her glance, could not avoid putting her small hand into Dorothea's, which clasped it with gentle motherliness, and immediately a doubt of her own prepossessions began to stir within her. Rosamond's eye was quick for faces. She saw that Mrs. Casaubon's face looked pale and changed since yesterday, yet gentle, and like the firm softness of her hand. But Dorothea had counted a little too much on her own strength. The clearness and intensity of her mental action this morning were the continuance of a nervous exultation which made her frame as dangerously responsive as a bit of finest Venetian crystal, and in looking at Rosamond, she suddenly found her heart swelling, and was unable to speak. All her effort was required to keep back tears. She succeeded in that, and the emotion only passed over her face like the spirit of a sob, but it added to Rosamond's impression that Mrs. Casaubon's state of mind must be something quite different from what she had imagined. So they sat down without a word of preface on the two chairs that happened to be nearest, and happened also to be close together, though Rosamond's notion when she first bowed was that she should stay a long way off from Mrs. Casaubon. But she ceased thinking how anything would turn out, merely wondering what would come, and Dorothea began to speak quite simply, gathering firmness as she went on. "I had an errand yesterday which I did not finish. That is why I am here again so soon. You will not think me too troublesome when I tell you that I came to talk to you about the injustice that has been shown towards Mr. Lydgate. It will cheer you, will it not, to know a great deal about him, that he may not like to speak about himself just because it is in his own vindication and to his own honor. You will like to know that your husband has warm friends, who have not left off believing in his high character. You will let me speak of this without thinking that I take a liberty." The cordial, pleading tones which seemed to flow with generous heedlessness above all the facts which had filled Rosamond's mind as grounds of obstruction and hatred between her and this woman, came as soothingly as a warm stream over her shrinking fears. Of course Mrs. Casaubon had the facts in her mind, but she was not going to speak of anything connected with them. That relief was too great for Rosamond to feel much else at the moment. She answered prettily, in the new ease of her soul, "I know you have been very good. I shall like to hear anything you will say to me about Tertius." "The day before yesterday," said Dorothea, "when I had asked him to come to Lowick to give me his opinion on the affairs of the hospital, he told me everything about his conduct and feelings in this sad event which has made ignorant people cast suspicions on him. The reason he told me was because I was very bold and asked him. I believed that he had never acted dishonorably, and I begged him to tell me the history. He confessed to me that he had never told it before, not even to you, because he had a great dislike to say, 'I was not wrong,' as if that were proof, when there are guilty people who will say so. The truth is he knew nothing of this man Raffles, or that there were any bad secrets about him, and he thought that Mr. Bulstrode offered him the money because he repented, out of kindness, of having refused it before. All his anxiety about his patient was to treat him rightly, and he was a little uncomfortable that the case did not end as he had expected. But he thought then and still thinks that there may have been no wrong in it on any one's part. And I have told Mr. Fairbrother and Mr. Brooke and Sir James Chetham, they all believe in your husband. That will cheer you, will it not? That will give you courage." Dorothea's face had become animated, and as it beamed on Rosamond very close to her, she felt something like bashful timidity before a superior, in the presence of the self-forgetful ardor. She said, with blushing embarrassment, "Thank you. You are very kind." And he felt that he had been so wrong not to pour out everything about this to you. "But you will forgive him. It was because he feels so much more about your happiness than anything else. He feels his life bound into one with yours, and it hurts him more than anything that his misfortunes must hurt you. He could speak to me because I am an indifferent person, and then I asked him if I may come to see you, because I felt so much for his trouble and yours. That is why I came yesterday and why I am come today. Trouble is so hard to bear, is it not? How can we live and think that any one has trouble, piercing trouble, and we could help them, and never try?" Dorothea, completely swayed by the feeling that she was uttering, forgot everything but that she was speaking from out the heart of her own trial to Rosamond's. The emotion had wrought itself more and more into her utterance, till the tones may have gone to one's very marrow, like a low cry from some suffering creature in the darkness. and she had unconsciously laid her hand again on the little hand that she had pressed before. Rosamond, with an overmastering pang, as if a wound within her had been probed, burst into hysterical crying as she had done the day before when she clung to her husband. Poor Dorothea was feeling a great wave of her own sorrow returning over her, her thought being drawn to the possible share that Wladislaw may have in Rosamond's mental tumult. She was beginning to fear that she should not be able to suppress herself enough to the end of this meeting, and while her hand was still resting on Rosamond's lap, though the hand underneath it was withdrawn, she was struggling against her own rising sobs. She tried to master herself with the thought that this may be a turning point in 3 lives, not in her own. No, there the irrevocable had happened, but in those 3 lives which were touching hers with the solemn neighborhood of danger and distress, the fragile creature, who was crying close to her, there may still be time to rescue her from the misery of false and compatible bonds, and this moment was unlike any other. She and Rosamond could never be together again with the same thrilling consciousness of yesterday within them both. She felt the relation between them to be peculiar enough to give her a peculiar influence, though she had no conception that the way in which her own feelings were involved was fully known to Mrs. Lydgate. It was a newer crisis in Rosamond's experience than even Dorothea could imagine. She was under the first great shock that had shattered her dream world in which she had been easily confident of herself and critical of others, and this strange unexpected manifestation of feeling in a woman whom she had approached with a shrinking aversion and dread, as one who must necessarily have a jealous hatred towards her, made her soul totter all the more with the sense that she had been walking in an unknown world which had just broken in upon her. When Rosamond's convulsed throat was subsiding into calm, and she withdrew the handkerchief with which she had been hiding her face, her eyes met Dorothea's as helplessly as if they had been blue flowers. What was the use of thinking about behavior after this crying? And Dorothea looked almost as childish, with the neglected trace of a silent tear. Pride was broken down between these two. "We were talking about your husband," Dorothea said, with some timidity. "I thought his looks were sadly changed with suffering the other day. I had not seen him for many weeks before. He said he had been feeling very lonely in his trial, but I think he would have borne it all better if he had been able to be quite open with you." "Tertius is so angry and impatient if I say anything," said Rosamond, imagining that he had been complaining of her to Dorothea. "He ought not to wonder that I object to speak to him on painful subjects." "It was himself he blamed for not speaking," said Dorothea. "What he said of you was that he could not be happy in doing anything which made you unhappy, that his marriage was of course a bond which must affect his choice about everything, and for that reason he refused my proposal that he should keep his position at the hospital, because that would bind him to stay in Middlemarch, and he would not undertake to do anything which would be painful to you. He could say that to me, because he knows that I had much trial in my marriage, from my husband's illness, which hindered his plans and saddened him, and he knows that I have felt how hard it is to walk always in fear of hurting another who is tied to us." Dorothea waited a little. She had discerned a faint pleasure stealing over Rosamond's face, but there was no answer, and she went on, with a gathering tremor. "Marriage is so unlike everything else. There is something evening awful in the nearness it brings. Evening, if we loved someone else better than those we were married to, it would be no use." Poor Dorothea, in her palpitating anxiety, could only seize her language brokenly. "I mean, marriage drinks up all our power of giving or getting any blessedness in that sort of love. I know it may be very dear, but it murders our marriage, and then the marriage stays with us like a murder, and everything else is gone. And then our husband, if he loved and trusted us, and we have not helped him, but made a curse in his life." Her voice had sunk very low. There was a dread upon her of presuming too far, and of speaking as if she herself were perfection addressing error. She was too much preoccupied with her own anxiety to be aware that Rosamond was trembling too, and filled with the need to express pitying fellowship rather than rebuke. She put her hands on Rosamond's, and said with more agitated rapidity, I know that the feeling may be very dear. It has taken hold of us unawares. It is so hard. It may seem like death to part with it, and we are weak. I am weak, The waves of her own sorrow, from out of which she was struggling to save another, rushed over Dorothea with conquering force. She stopped in speechless agitation, not crying, but feeling as if she were being inwardly grappled. Her face had become of a deathlier paleness, her lips trembled, and she pressed her hands helplessly on the hands that lay under them. Rosamond, taken hold of by an emotion stronger than her own, hurried along in a new movement which gave all things some new, awful, undefined aspect, could find no words, but involuntarily she put her lips to Dorothea's forehead, which was very near her, and then for a minute the two women clasped each other as if they had been in a shipwreck. "You are thinking what is not true," said Rosamond, in an eager half-whisper, while she was still feeling Dorothea's arms round her, urged by a mysterious necessity to free herself from something that oppressed her as if it were blood guiltiness. They moved apart, looking at each other. "When you came in yesterday, it was not as you thought," said Rosamond in the same tone. There was a movement of surprised attention in Dorothea. She expected a vindication of Rosamond herself. "He was telling me how he loved another woman, that I may know he could never love me," said Rosamond, getting more and more hurried as she went on. "And now I think he hates me because you mistook him yesterday. He says it is through me that you will think ill of him, think that he is a false person. But it shall not be through me. He has never had any love for me. I know he has not. He has always thought slightly of me. He said yesterday that no other woman existed for him beside you. The blame of what happened is entirely mine. He said he could never explain to you, because of me. He said you could never think well of him again. But now I have told you, and he cannot reproach me any more." Rosamond had delivered her soul under impulses which she had not known before. She had begun her confession under the subduing influence of Dorothea's emotion, and as she went on she had gathered the sense that she was repelling Will's reproaches, which were still like a knife wound within her. The revulsion of feeling in Dorothea was too strong to be called joy. It was a tumult in which the terrible strain of the night and morning made a resistant pain. She could only perceive that this would be joy when she had recovered her power of feeling it. Her immediate consciousness was one of immense sympathy without check. She cared for Rosamond without struggle now, and responded earnestly to her last words. "No, he cannot reproach you any more." With her usual tendency to overestimate the good in others, she felt a great outgoing of her heart towards Rosamond for the generous effort which had redeemed her from suffering, not counting that the effort was a reflex of her own energy. After they had been silent a little, she said, "You are not sorry that I came this morning?" "No, you have been very good to me," said Rosamond. "I did not think that you would be so good. I was very unhappy. I am not happy now. Everything is so sad. But better days will come. Your husband will be rightly valued, and he depends on you for comfort. He loves you best. The worst loss would be to lose that, and you have not lost it," said Dorothea. She tried to thrust away the too overpowering thought of her own relief, lest she should fail to win some sign that Rosamond's affection was yearning back towards her husband. "Tertius did not find fault with me, then," said Rosamond, understanding now that Lydgate may have said anything to Mrs. Casaubon, and that she certainly was different from other women. Perhaps there was a faint taste of jealousy in the question. A smile began to play over Dorothea's face as she said, "No, truly, how could you imagine it?" But here the door opened and Lydgate entered. "I am come back in my quality of doctor," he said. "After I went away, I was haunted by two pale faces. Mrs. Casaubon looked as much in need of care as you, Rosie, and I thought that I had not done my duty in leaving you together. So when I had been to Coleman's I came home again. I noticed that you were walking, Mrs. Casaubon, and the sky has changed. I think we may have rain. May I send someone to order your carriage to come for you?" "Oh, no. I am strong. I need the walk," said Dorothea, rising with animation in her face. "Mrs. Lydgate and I have chatted a great deal, and it is time for me to go. I have always been accused of being immoderate and saying too much." She put out her hand to Rosamond, and they said in earnest, quiet goodbye without kiss or other show of effusion. There had been between them too much serious emotion for them to use the signs of it superficially. As Lydgate took her to the door, she said nothing of Rosamond, but told him of Mr. Fairbrother and the other friends who had listened with belief to his story. When he came back to Rosamond, she had already thrown herself on the sofa, in resigned fatigue. "Well, Rosie," he said, standing over her, and touching her hair, "what do you think of Mrs. Casaubon now you have seen so much of her?" "I think she must be better than anyone," said Rosamond, "and she is very beautiful. If you go to talk to her so often, you will be more discontented with me than ever." Lydgate laughed at the "so often." "But has she made you any less discontented with me?" "I think she has," said Rosamond, looking up in his face. "How heavy your eyes are, Tertius, and do push your hair back." He lifted up his large white hand to obey her, and felt thankful for this little mark of interest in him. Poor Rosamond's vagrant fancy had come back terribly scourged, meek enough to nestle under the old despised shelter. And the shelter was still there. Lydgate had accepted his narrowed lot with sad resignation. He had chosen this fragile creature, and had taken the burthen of her life upon his arms. Chapter LXXI. My grief lies onward and my joy behind. Shakespeare, Sonnets. Exiles notoriously feed much on hopes, and are unlikely to stay in banishment, unless they are obliged. When Wladislaw exiled himself from Middlemarch, he had placed no stronger obstacle to his return than his own resolve, which was by no means an iron barrier, but simply a state of mind liable to melt into a minuet with other states of mind, and to find itself bowing, smiling, and giving place with polite facility. As the months went on, it had seemed more and more difficult to him to say why he should not run down to Middlemarch, merely for the sake of hearing something about Dorothea, and if on such a flying visit he should chance by some strange coincidence to meet with her, there was no reason for him to be ashamed of having taken an innocent journey which he had beforehand supposed that he should not take. Since he was hopelessly divided from her, he may surely venture into her neighborhood, and as to the suspicious friends who kept a dread watch over her, their opinions seemed less and less important with time and change of air, and there had come a reason quite irrespective of Dorothea, which seemed to make a journey to Middlemarch a sort of philanthropic duty. Will had given a disinterested attention to an intended settlement on a new plan in the far west, and the need for funds in order to carry out a good design had set him on debating with himself whether it would not be a laudable use to make of his claim on Bulstrode, to urge the application of that money which had been offered to himself as a means of carrying out a scheme likely to be largely beneficial. The question seemed a very dubious one to Will, and his repugnance to again entering into any relation with the banker may have made him dismiss it quickly, if there had not arisen in his imagination the probability that his judgment may be more safely determined by a visit to Middlemarch. That was the object which Will stated to himself as a reason for coming down. He had meant to confide in Lydgate, and discuss the money question with him, and he had meant to amuse himself for the few evenings of his stay by having a great deal of music and badinage with fair Rosamond, without neglecting his friends at Lowick Parsonage. If the parsonage was close to the manor, that was no fault of his. He had neglected the Fairbrothers before his departure, from a proud resistance to the possible accusation of indirectly seeking interviews with Dorothea. But hunger tames us, and Will had become very hungry for the vision of a certain form and the sound of a certain voice. Nothing had done instead, not the opera, or the converse of zealous politicians, or the flattering reception in dim corners of his new hand in leading articles. Thus he had come down, foreseeing with confidence how almost everything would be in his familiar little world, fearing, truly, that there would be no surprises in his visit. But he had found that humdrum world in a terribly dynamic condition, in which evening badinage and lyrism had turned explosive, and the first day of this visit had become the most fatal epoch of his life. The next morning he felt so harassed with the nightmare of consequences, he dreaded so much the immediate issues before him, that seeing while he breakfasted the arrival of the Riverston coach, he went out hurriedly and took his place on it, that he may be relieved, at least for a day, from the necessity of doing or saying anything in Middlemarch. Will Ladislaw was in one of those tangled crises, which are commoner in experience than one may imagine from the shallow absoluteness of men's judgments. He had found Lydgate, for whom he had the sincerest respect, under circumstances which claimed his thorough and frankly declared sympathy, and the reason why, in spite of that claim, it would have been better for Will to have avoided all further intimacy or evening contact with Lydgate, was precisely of the kind to make such a course appear impossible to a creature of Will's susceptible temperament, without any neutral region of indifference in his nature, ready to turn everything that befell him into the collisions of a passionate drama. The revelation that Rosamond had made her happiness in any way dependent on him was a difficulty which his outburst of rage towards her had immeasurably increased for him. He hated his own cruelty, and yet he dreaded to show the fullness of his relenting. He must go to her again. The friendship could not be put to a sudden end, and her unhappiness was a power which he dreaded, and all the while there was no more foretaste of enjoyment in the life before him than if his limbs had been lopped off and he was making his fresh start on crutches. In the night he had debated whether he should not get on the coach, not for Riverston, but for London, leaving a note to Lydgate which would give a makeshift reason for his retreat. But there were strong cords pulling him back from that abrupt departure, the blight on his happiness in thinking of Dorothea, the crushing of that chief hope which had remained in spite of the acknowledged necessity for renunciation, was too fresh a misery for him to resign himself to it and go immediately into a distance which was also despair. Thus he did nothing more decided than taking the Riverston coach. He came back again by it, while it was still daylight, having made up his mind that he must go to Lydgate's that evening. The Rubicon, we know, was a very insignificant stream to look at. Its significance lay entirely in certain invisible conditions. Will felt as if he were forced to cross his small boundary ditch, and what he saw beyond it was not empire, but discontented subjection. But it is given to us sometimes evening in our everyday life to witness the saving influence of a noble nature, the divine efficacy of rescue, that may lie in a self-subduing act of fellowship. If Dorothea, after her night's anguish, had not taken that walk to Rosamond, why, she perhaps would have been a woman who gained a higher character for discretion, but it would certainly not have been as well for those three who were on one hearth in Lydgate's house at 7:30 that evening. Rosamond had been prepared for Will's visit, and she received him with a languid coldness which Lydgate accounted for by her nervous exhaustion, of which he could not suppose that it had any relation to Will. And, when she sat in silence bending over a bit of work, he innocently apologized for her in an indirect way by begging her to lean backward and rest. Will was miserable in the necessity for playing the part of a friend who was making his first appearance and greeting to Rosamond, while his thoughts were busy about her feelings since that scene of yesterday, which seemed still inexorably to enclose them both, like the painful vision of a double madness. It happened that nothing called Lydgate out of the room, but when Rosamond poured out the tea, and Will came near to fetch it, she placed a tiny bit of folded paper in his saucer. He sought it and secured it quickly, but as he went back to his inn he had no eagerness to unfold the paper. What Rosamond had written to him would probably deepen the painful impressions of the evening. Still, he opened and read it by his bed candle. There were only these few words in her neatly flowing hand. I have told Mrs. Casaubon. She is not under any mistake about you. I told her because she came to see me and was very kind. You will have nothing to reproach me with now. I shall not have made any difference to you. The effect of these words was not quite all gladness. As Will dwelt on them with excited imagination, he felt his cheeks and ears burning at the thought of what had occurred between Dorothea and Rosamond, at the uncertainty how far Dorothea may still feel her dignity wounded in having an explanation of his conduct offered to her. There may still remain in her mind a changed association with him, which made an irremediable difference, a lasting flaw. With active fancy he wrought himself into a state of doubt little more easy than that of the man who has escaped from wreck by night, and stands on unknown ground in the darkness. until that wretched yesterday, except the moment of vexation long ago in the very same room and in the very same presence, all their vision, all their thought of each other had been as in a world apart, where the sunshine fell on tall white lilies, where no evil lurked, and no other soul entered.